She was just another passenger in first class, quiet, polite, and waiting for her drink, but when the flight attendant reached her row, everything changed. The juice she had poured for every other passenger suddenly unavailable. The service that came with a smile for everyone else turned cold, and when the girl asked why, she was given nothing but excuses. What the flight attendant didn't know, she had just denied the daughter of the airline's owner, and the message of the girl just sent was about to change everything. Before we start the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more. The cabin buzzed with the soft hum of passengers settling into their seats, adjusting their bags, and flipping through in-flight magazines. The scent of fresh coffee and airline meals drifted through the air as the flight attendants moved officially down the aisles. Among them was Miss Keaton, a senior flight attendant known for her strict demeanor. She carried herself with an air of she made sure everything went exactly as she liked it. Her uniform was spotless, and she sat stiffly with her eyes fixed on the first-class cabin near the window. A teenage girl named Zahara sat quietly with her hands on her lap and her seatbelt fastened. She had boarded the flight alone, which she had done many times before, but this time felt different. She was excited because she knew she would soon get to her destination, where her father Idris was waiting. She was wearing nothing but a simple sweater and jeans. Flashy, nothing that would draw attention. She wasn't the type to cause trouble, and she wasn't looking for any. A few minutes after takeoff, the flight attendants began their service. Miss Keaton moved through the rows with practiced efficiency, greeting passengers with polite smiles and offering drinks from the silver tray in her hands. She poured fresh orange juice into a tall glass for the businessman in seat 1A, handed a sparkling water to the woman in 1B, and filled a crystal-clear goblet with apple juice for the man across the aisle. When she reached Zahara's seat, her smile faded slightly, her eyes flicking over her. There was a brief pause, so quick that most wouldn't have noticed, but Zahara did. "Can I have some orange juice, please?" Zahara asked, her voice polite. Miss Keaton barely glanced at her as she straightened the tray in her hands. "We're only serving water right now," she replied curtly before turning to the next passenger. Zahara blinked, confused. She had just watched the same woman pour 3 different types of juice for the passengers in front of her. She looked down at her tray table where a glass of water had been placed without asking. Something felt off, but she brushed it aside. Maybe juice service would come later. A few minutes passed and Miss Khan continued serving drinks, her tone light and friendly as she chatted with other passengers. Zahara watched as another flight attendant, a younger woman named Elise, came down the aisle holding a new tray. This one was filled with more juice options: pineapple, cranberry, and even a fancy fruit blend for those who requested it. One by one, the passengers around her received their drinks, the glasses clinking softly as they were placed on trays. Zahara waited when Miss Katan passed by. Then Zahara tried once more, this time with a small smile. "Excuse me, could I have some juice now?" Miss Katan stopped, turning back with an impatient look. "Like I said, we're only serving water for now." Zahara's stomach twisted. She wasn't the type to argue, but she wasn't imagining things. The man sitting 2 seats away had just received a glass of pineapple juice. The woman across the aisle was Zahara swallowed and kept her voice steady. "I just saw you give juice to them," she said. Miss Keaton's eyes narrowed a little and her fingers tightened around the tray, but her expression didn't change. "Look, young lady, I don't have time to go back and forth. We have limited supplies and juice is reserved for first-class passengers." The words were harsh, but it wasn't just what she said. It was how she said them, the condescending tone, the dismissive glance, the way she looked at Zahara as if she were a problem, that made her stand out. Needed to be handled quickly. The man across the aisle shifted in his seat, glancing toward them before looking away, pretending not to notice. The woman near the front took a sudden interest in the safety pamphlet she had ignored earlier. Elise, who had been serving drinks nearby, hesitated mid-step, her brows drawing together, but she said nothing. Zahara felt her face grow warm, not just with confusion, but something else. It wasn't just about the juice anymore, it was about the fact that she had been the only one refused. That this Woman had looked at her and without asking questions had decided she wasn't supposed to be here. She took a deep breath and picked up her phone, typing a quick message. Dad, the flight attendant is refusing to serve me juice. Everyone else got one, but she told me it's only for first-class passengers. She pressed send, then locked the screen, her fingers tightening slightly around the edges of her phone. Miss Keaton turned, walking back toward the galley. Without her second glance, she had no idea that the message Zahara just sent would change everything. Zahara put her phone on her lap and gripped the edge of her tray table. The cabin felt colder, and the quiet hum of the plane couldn't drown out the uneasy feeling that was creeping up her spine. She stole a glance at the other passengers, wondering if anyone had really noticed what had happened. The businessman across the aisle was fidgeting with his tie while pretending to focus on his laptop screen, and the woman near the front was slowly sipping her drink while her eyes were glued to the in-flight magazine. No one wanted to admit it. Seen it, but silence was easier. A soft vibration in her lap caught her attention. Her father Idris had replied, "What do you mean?" She refused. Did she say why? Zahara hesitated before typing back. She acted like I don't belong in first class. She said the juice is for first-class passengers only, but she gave it to everyone else. There was a long pause before the three dots appeared indicating he was typing. Then the message came through. What's the flight number? Zahara's heart pounded as she quickly checked her boarding pass, and Idris never acted on impulse, but she knew him well enough to know when he was mad. His silence between messages wasn't hesitation, it was thought. A few rows ahead, Elise walked toward the galley, her steps slower than usual because she had seen everything and wasn't sure what she could do. The situation made her feel bad, and Miss Keaton had worked for the airline for years, but this wasn't the first time she had seen her treat some passengers differently. It was the first time it had been this obvious in the galley. Miss Keaton poured herself a small cup of coffee and looked calm. Elise hesitated before speaking. Did that girl in 3A really not get any juice? Keton barely glanced up and asked. I didn't have time to double back. Elise frowned, but there was still juice left. Miss Keaton gave Elise a dismissive chuckle look. You'll learn that some passengers like to test the limits. She probably got that seat as a used one or through some mix-up. First-class service is for first-class passengers. It's not a buffet. Liz stiffened. She is a first-class passenger. Miss Keaton rolled her eyes. I don't need a lecture, bro. Check on row 5. Elise hesitated, aided, but eventually walked away, though unease sat heavy in her chest. Something about this didn't feel right. Back in her seat, Zahara refreshed her phone screen, waiting for her father's response. When it finally came through, it was just 2 words. Stay seated. Zahara exhaled slowly. She wasn't sure what her father was planning, but Miss Keton had just made a big mistake, that much was clear. Zahara stared at her phone, her father's last message playing over and over in her mind. Stay seated. Those 2 words meant more to her than anything else he could have said. She knew her father well. If he told her to stay put, it meant something was already happening. She shifted in her seat and looked toward the front of the cabin, where Miss Keton was now talking to another passenger. Her posture was relaxed, as if she hadn't just embarrassed Miss Keton. The sight of her acting so normal after what she had done made Zahara's stomach twist. Minutes passed. The flight attendants continued their service, offering refills to other passengers while Zahara's tray remained untouched. Yoli walked by, her eyes lingering on Zahara's untouched glass of water before hesitantly looking away. She wanted to say something, but the tension in the cabin made it difficult. Then an announcement crackled over the intercom. Miss Keaton, please report to the cockpit immediately. The sudden call made a few passengers glance up. Zahara's grip on her phone tightened up near the galley. Miss Keton frowned, clearly surprised. Flight attendants didn't get called to the cockpit unless something was serious. She quickly smoothed her uniform, adjusting her collar before making her way to the front of the plane. Elise watched her go, her brows slightly furrowed. Inside the cockpit, the captain, Graham Foster, was seated with his hands folded neatly in front of him. His face was calm, but there was a seriousness in his eyes that made Miss Keton straighten. On the screen of the in-flight phone, a man appeared whom Miss Keaton immediately recognized as Damon Whitaker, the senior operations manager for the airline. This was the first time Miss Keaton had spoken to Damon, and it wasn't in a casual setting. The man's voice was clear and direct. "Miss Keaton, we have received a complaint regarding your in-flight service. A first-class passenger was denied a standard beverage request. Can you explain why?" Miss Keaton stiffened but quickly forced a smile. "You sir, there was no refusal. We have a limited supply of beverages, and I simply hadn't gotten to her request yet." Damon's expression didn't change. "That's not the report we received." The air inside the cockpit felt heavier. Miss Keaton's hands instinctively clasped in front of her, a habit she had whenever she was under pressure. "With all due respect, passengers misunderstand things all the time. I was simply following standard procedure." The captain, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke. "Are you aware of who this passenger is?" Miss Keaton frowned, glancing between them. "I don't believe so." Damon leaned slightly closer to the screen. "Her name is Zahara Idris. Her father owns this airline." The words hit Miss Keaton like a sudden drop in altitude. Her breath caught for just a second, but she recovered quickly, forcing a composed expression. "I know excuses." Damon's voice was sharp. "Now you will return to your station immediately, provide the service that was requested, and issue an apology in front of the passengers." Miss Keaton swallowed. This wasn't just an order, it was a warning. She nodded stiffly, understood. As she turned to leave the cockpit, her pulse pounded in her ears. She had spent years controlling passengers, ensuring they followed the rules of her cabin, but now for the first time she was the one being ordered to fix her mistake, and she had no idea what was waiting for her when she stepped back into the aisle. Miss Keaton stepped out of the cockpit, her breath uneven as she forced herself to walk calmly back toward the first-class cabin. Her usual confidence felt. She had dealt with difficult passengers before, but this wasn't just any passenger. It was the daughter of the man who ran the whole airline. As she walked down the aisle, she could feel the weight of other passengers' eyes on her. Did they know? Had word already spread? The thought burned her face. She quickly straightened her uniform, smoothing her hands over the fabric as she walked towards Zahara's seat. Zahara hadn't moved. She was sitting comfortably, her face hidden by her fingers. She was not nervous or upset like Miss Keaton was. Instead, she looked up with a calm, almost expectant look on her face. When Miss Keaton finally stopped in front of her, Miss Keaton forced a smile on her face and said, "Miss Harris, I'm sorry for any confusion earlier. I'd be happy to bring you any drink you'd like." Zahara could tell there was tension behind her words because of the stiffness in her voice and the hesitation in her posture. It wasn't a real apology. This was a flight attendant trying to clean up a mistake before it became something bigger. Zahara tilted her head slightly, a misunderstanding. Miss Keaton nodded quickly, her fingers tightening around the tray she held. "Yes, of course, I didn't mean to cause any inconvenience." Zahara let the silence stretch just long enough for Miss Keaton to shift uncomfortably. Then she spoke again, her voice soft but firm. "You didn't give anyone else water without asking. You didn't refuse anyone else juice. So what exactly was the misunderstanding?" The question made some passengers turned their heads to look like they weren't listening, but it was clear they were interested. Miss Keaton's throat felt dry, and she stopped trying to come up with an excuse, any excuse, but there wasn't one. Zahara didn't need to argue. She already had the upper hand, but she wasn't going to let Miss Keaton get away with it. She folded her hands on her lap and spoke again, her words quiet but unmistakable. "If you're going to say you're sorry, at least be honest about why you made that choice." Miss Keaton's stomach twisted. For the first time she felt small. The young girl in front of her had turned the power dynamic completely around. The same passengers who had ignored the situation earlier were now watching intently, waiting to see what would happen next. A deep, unsettling realization sank into Miss Keaton's chest. She had misjudged Zahara, and now everyone could see it. Miss Keaton stood frozen for a moment, gripping the tray so tightly that her knuckles turned pale. The weight of Zahara's words settled over her like a passengers who had previously ignored the situation were now watching intently, their eyes flicking between the two. Some pretended to be reading or watching something on their screens, but their interest was clear. Zahara didn't smirk, gloat, or demand anything, she just waited. She wanted Miss Catan to admit what had really happened, not just try to fix the problem without addressing the real problem. Miss Catan took a sharp breath, trying to calm down. To regain control of the situation, she said in a neutral tone, "I may have misjudged the situation, but I assure you it wasn't intentional." Zahara raised an eyebrow. "Wasn't that?" That one question made Miss Keaton's stomach tighten. She looked around, trying to find a way out of the mounting pressure around her, but there was none. The cabin was silent, and everyone was looking at her. Elise, the younger flight attendant, stood near the galley with her arms folded as she watched the exchange. She had seen enough to know what was really going on, Miss Keaton. She wasn't saying sorry because she realized she had done wrong. She was saying sorry because she had been caught for the first time. Miss Keaton noticed that the mood in the cabin was changing. She was losing control. She had always been the leader in first class, making sure everything ran smoothly. But now the balance had shifted, and she wasn't in charge anymore. Zahara watched her, hoping for something real and meaningful, but she knew she wasn't going to get it. Was too proud and set in her ways to admit what she had really done. After a long pause, Zahara let out a sigh of relief and reached for her phone. She quickly texted her father, "I'm sorry, but I'm not admitting what I did." He replied, "Fine, I'll have the orange juice." That was all he said, but it was enough for Zahara. She put down her phone and looked up at Miss Catan again, her expression unreadable. Miss Catan nodded stiffly, eager to move on. She quickly turned and headed toward the galley, her legs feeling strangely unsteady as she disappeared behind the curtain. Ellie followed her, unable to stay silent any longer. "You should have just told her the truth." Miss Keaton spun around, her voice sharp. "I don't need a lecture from you." Elise Lo shook her head. "No, what you need is to realize that you didn't just misjudge her. You saw a young black girl in first class, and you assumed she didn't belong. You didn't check her ticket. You didn't ask questions as she just decided." Miss Keaton's jaw clenched. "I said I apologized." Elise scoffed. "No, you didn't. You just tried to make it go away." Miss Keaton opened her mouth to respond, but the sound of the intercom crackling to life cut through the air. "Miss Catan, please report to the cockpit immediately." Elise's expression didn't change. "Looks like you're not done answering for this." Miss Keaton's stomach dropped as she walked out of the galley for the second time that day, feeling the full weight of what was coming next. Miss Keaton's legs felt heavier with each step toward the cockpit. Her breath was shallow, her mind racing as she tried to anticipate what was waiting for her on the other side of that door. She had been called once already, and that had been bad enough, but a second call that meant something had escalated. Passengers turned their heads slightly as she passed, some pretending to be focused on their screens while others barely hid their curiosities. Zahara remained seated, calm as ever, her fingers lightly tapping against the armrest. She wasn't smiling, wasn't smirking, wasn't even looking at Miss Keaton anymore. That made it worse if she had been gloating. Miss Catan could have convinced herself that this was just a spoiled child making trouble, but Zahara wasn't reacting at all. She didn't need to. The damage had already been done. Miss Catan swallowed hard as she reached the cockpit door and knocked twice before stepping inside. Captain Graham Foster sat in his seat, his expression unreadable. The screen of the in-flight phone was still active and Damon Whitaker, the airline senior operations manager, was still on the line, but this time there was someone else. A second figure appeared on the screen, one that made the air in the cockpit feel heavier. Idris, the man who owned the airline, the man who controlled every flight, every employee, every decision made within the company, and most importantly, the man who had just received a direct complaint about her. Miss Keaton felt her mouth go dry. Idris was calm as always. His presence alone carried weight, not because he was loud, not because he was aggressive, but because he never needed to be even through a screen. His voice was controlled, steady, and cold. "Miss Keaton, he said evenly. Do you understand why you're here? Miss Keaton's pulse pounded in her ears. She clasped her hands together and forced herself to stay composed. Ed, sir, I assure you there was a misunderstanding. The passenger, my daughter, Idris corrected, his voice sharp as a blade. Miss Keaton's heart skipped. Your daughter, she corrected quickly, was never intentionally denied service. There was a timing issue. I don't believe that the way he said it left no room for argument. We have received multiple accounts from both passengers and staff regarding your behavior. Damon added, his tone just as unforgiving. You were given an opportunity to correct your mistake. Instead, you offered a weak apology and refused to acknowledge the real issue. Miss Keaton's fingers twitched. With all due respect, sir, I was simply following standard procedure. The situation has been resolved. Idris tilted his head slightly, studying her. Tell me, Miss Keaton, when you looked at Zahara, what exactly did you see? Miss Keaton hesitated. I don't understand the question. I think you do, Ider said. Because when you looked at her, you made a decision. You didn't question anyone else's seat. You didn't refuse service to anyone else. But when it came to my daughter, you assumed she didn't belong. The words hit her harder than she expected. She wanted to argue, wanted to defend herself. But Idris wasn't shouting. He wasn't insulting her. He was simply stating a fact, one she couldn't escape from. The silence in the cockpit stretched. Damon finally spoke again. You will return to your position for the remainder of this flight. Upon landing, you are to report directly to airline headquarters for formal review. Do you understand? Miss Keaton nodded, her throat too tight to speak, and Miss Keaton, Idris added, his tone even softer. Now I suggest you start thinking very carefully about how you're going to explain yourself, because as of right now your career is hanging by a thread. The screen went dark. The room was suddenly too quiet. Captain Foster let out a slow breath, then turned to Miss Keaton. You should get back to work. Miss Keaton nodded stiffly and turned to leave, but as she stepped out of the cockpit, she knew work wouldn't save her. Now Keaton stepped out of the cockpit, but this time she didn't walk with the same authority she once had. Her posture was rigid, her face stiff, but inside her mind was spiraling. A formal review, direct orders from the airline's owner, passengers watching her every move. This wasn't just a reprimand, this was the beginning of something much worse. As she made her way back to the first class cabin, the weight of the situation settled over her like a storm cloud she had always taken pride in. She used to be able to stay in charge, keep the cabin calm, and make decisions without question, but now she had lost control. She wasn't the one making decisions, she was the one being watched. When she got to the back seat, she hesitated for a split second before lowering herself to meet Miss Idris' eye level. Here is your orange juice, she said, forcing her voice to stay neutral. Zahara looked at the glass in front of her and then slowly looked back up at Miss Keaton. Her face didn't show much emotion, but the pause before she responded made Miss Keaton's skin prickle with discomfort. You seem nervous, Zahara said, her voice quiet. Miss Keaton's fingers tightened around the tray she was holding. I just want to ensure you receive the service you were entitled to, she replied. Zahara didn't take the glass immediately. Instead, she tilted her head slightly. Why now? Miss Keaton blinked. Excuse me, you had juice before, Zahara continued, her tone steady. You had plenty, you poured it for everyone else. She skipped me on purpose, and when I asked, you lied, and now suddenly you're bringing me what I asked for. Why? The question made Miss Keaton's stomach twist. She had been hoping that simply delivering the drink would make the moment pass quickly, that Zahara would take it and move on, but the girl wasn't letting her off that easy. Passengers around them were listening now, eyes flickering toward the interaction. A businessman 2 seats away shifted slightly, stealing a glance from behind his laptop. Allison, who had been refilling drinks a few rows back, stopped what she was doing and turned slightly toward then, watching Miss Keaton swallowed. I told you it was a misunderstanding. Zahara's expression remained unchanged. No, it wasn't. The silence stretched between them. Zahara finally reached for the glass, but before she lifted it, she spoke one last time. You made a choice. Miss Keaton felt her throat tighten. She had spent years enforcing policies, deciding who got what, who was worth extra effort, and who wasn't. She had done it without thinking, but this time she had been caught, and now there was no escaping it. Zahara took A slow sip of her juice, then placed the glass down with a quiet clink. She didn't need to say anything else. The silence was enough. Miss Catan stood up stiffly and turned away, making her way back to the galley, but as she walked she felt something she had never felt before. She wasn't in charge anymore, and everyone knew it. Miss Keaton's steps were quick and stiff as she walked back toward the galley, her hands clenched at her sides. The moment she passed through the curtain she exhaled sharply, gripping the counter for support. The pressure in her chest felt suffocating. She had been humiliated in front of the entire first-class cabin by a teenager. Elise stood at the other end of the galley watching her carefully. She had seen M. Catan handle plenty of difficult passengers before, but never like this, never with this kind of tension, this kind of weight pressing down on her. Rough moment, Illy asked, her voice unreadable. Miss Keaton shot her a sharp look. Not now, Illy. Elise shrugged. But didn't move. You know, she didn't even have to raise her voice. She said, "That's what's really bothering you, isn't it?" Miss Keaton let out a dry laugh, though there was no humor in it. "I don't need a lecture from you." "No, I don't think you need a lecture," Elise replied, crossing her arms. "I think you need to realize that the way you've been treating people, it finally caught up with you." Miss Khan's jaw tightened. "I treated her the same way I would have treated anyone." Illy raised an eyebrow. "Really? Then why did you only refuse service to her?" The words hit deeper than Miss Catan expected. For a moment she considered snapping back with a sharp response, something to end the conversation, to shut Elise down, but nothing came because deep down she knew Elise was right. Miss Keaton turned away, pretending to adjust a stack of cups, her mind searching for something, anything that would make this feel less like her fault, but she couldn't find it. Her reflection in the metal panel of the galley cabinet stared back at her, and for the first time she saw herself from the outside. A flight attendant who had spent years believing she was untouchable, a woman who had made assumptions about passengers without thinking twice, and now she was the one under scrutiny. A chime from the in-flight phone made both women turn their heads. Miss Keaton hesitated before reaching for it. "This is Miss Keaton." The voice on the other end was calm but firm. "Miss Keaton, this is Captain Foster. Just letting you know we've received additional instructions from ground control regarding your status. After landing you are to remain on board until further notice." Miss Caton's stomach turned. "Remain on board?" "That's correct," the captain confirmed. "Security will be waiting at the gate. You'll be escorted for a formal meeting with airline management." The line clicked off. Illy let out a slow breath. "Well," she muttered, "that's not good." Miss Keaton's grip on the phone tightened, but she didn't say a word. There was nothing left to say, because for the first time in her entire career she wasn't sure if she'd still have a job by the time this flight landed. Miss Keaton placed the phone back on the hook, but her fingers trembled slightly as she let go. The air in the galley felt stifling, as if the walls had closed in on her. "Security, formal meeting, ground control." The words echoed in her mind like a warning siren. She had spent years ensuring passengers followed the rules, making sure things were done her way, but now she was the one under orders. She was the one being watched, scrutinized, judged, and the worst part, she had no control over what happened next. Elise was still standing nearby, pretending to wipe down the counter, but it was clear she was waiting for a reaction. She wasn't gloating, but there was something knowing in her expression, something that told Miss Catan she had seen this coming long before today. Miss Catan let out a slow, controlled breath and straightened her uniform. "I need to finish my shift," she muttered, mostly to herself. Elise scoffed. "Do you think handing out a few more drinks is going to change anything?" Miss Keaton ignored her and stepped back into the first-class cabin, but this time everything felt different. The moment she entered the aisle she felt it. The shift passengers were just watching her. They were judging her. She could feel their eyes tracking her every move, quiet whispers passing between them. She had never minded being the center of attention before. She had always been the one in charge, the one who set the tone of the cabin, but now the power dynamic had flipped. For the first time she was the outsider. She moved stiffly, forcing a polite smile as she adjusted a tray on a passenger's table. The man barely nodded at her, his expression unreadable. Across the aisle, a woman in a gray blazer glanced at her, then looked away. Just as quickly. Sahara was still in her seat scrolling through her phone, her face calm. She hadn't said a word since their last exchange, but she didn't need to. She had already done enough. Keaton took another step forward when she heard it, a whisper. It came from behind her, barely above the hum of the plane. That's the one. The words sent a cold chill down her spine. She didn't turn around, didn't react, but she knew people were talking. The story had already started spreading. Passengers had seen what happened, and now they were sharing it. Quietly, softly, but it was happening. Miss Keaton had always believed she was untouchable, that no matter how she handled the situation, the airline would back her, but now she wasn't so sure. She swallowed the knot in her throat and kept walking, pretending not to hear the whispers, pretending not to feel the stares burning into her back. But no matter how much she tried to ignore it, one thought kept creeping back into her mind. This wasn't going away, and with every passing minute, it was only getting worse. Keaton moved robotically through the aisle, forcing herself to continue the routine of service, but everything felt off. Her hands weren't as steady, her voice wasn't as firm, and the forced politeness in her tone no longer held the same weight. The passengers could feel too the shift in power, the uncomfortable energy lingering in the air. Businessman in C2C cleared his throat as she passed, his eyes flicking towards Sahara before settling on Miss Keaton. Not your best moment, was it? He muttered under his breath. Miss Keaton stiffened, her fingers tightening around the tray she was holding. She didn't respond. She couldn't. She quickly turned toward another passenger, an older woman in seat 4A, and forced to smile. Can I offer you anything else, ma'am? The woman barely looked up from her book. Just water, please. Miss Keaton reached for a bottle, but as she placed it on the tray table, the woman spoke again softly without looking at her. I saw what happened. The words sent a fresh wave of unease through Miss Keaton's chest. She swallowed hard. Excuse me, she said, keeping her voice neutral. The woman finally met her gaze, her expression unreadable. I've been flying first class for years. I know how things work. I know who gets treated a certain way and who doesn't. She paused, as if considering whether or not to say more, than in a tone that was neither cool nor kind, she added, you made a mistake today. Miss Keaton felt heat rise up her neck. The way the woman spoke, calm, matter of fact, with quiet certainty, made it worse. There was no accusation, no anger, just the undeniable truth. A mistake. The words lingered in Miss Keaton's mind as she stepped away, trying to steady her breathing. She wasn't used to feeling exposed like this. She was the one who controlled the cabin, not the one who got whispered about. She turned toward the galley, needing a moment to breathe, but just as she did, she caught sight of something that made her stomach drop. Ace was standing near Zahara's seat, and she was handing her a fresh glass of orange juice. Miss Keaton froze. Zahara accepted the drink with a small nod, not looking surprised at all. Elise spoke softly, but Miss Keaton couldn't make out the words from where she stood. Then, before walking away, Elise did something unexpected. She placed a small pack of cookies on Zahara's tray, a quiet, simple gesture. It shouldn't have meant anything, but it did, because it was more than just an act of kindness. It was a statement. Miss Keaton clenched her jaw, her heart pounding. Elise had just undermined her, not in an obvious confrontational way, but in a way that sent a clear message to everyone watching. Zahara deserved better. Miss Keaton turned sharply and stormed back toward the galley, her hands shaking with frustration. She slammed the tray down on the counter, gripping the edge so hard that her nails dug into the metal surface. Elise followed a moment later, her expression unreadable. What the hell was that? Miss Keaton snapped, keeping her voice low but furious. Elise leaned against the counter, crossing her arms. What Miss Keaton's eyes burned with anger. You went behind my back. Ellie shrugged. I did my job. No, you didn't. Miss Keaton's voice was sharper now. You deliberately corrected me in front of passengers. Elise didn't flinch because you were wrong. The words landed like a slap. Miss Keaton let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. You have no idea what you've just done. Elise tilted her head slightly. Oh, I think I do. Miss Keaton narrowed her eyes. You think this makes you a hero? Elle sighed, her voice quieter now. But I think for the first time someone held you accountable, and you don't know how to handle it. Miss Keaton stared at her, breathing heavily. She had spent years in control, years making decisions without question, but now everything was slipping away, and Elise was right. She didn't know how to handle it. She didn't know what to do. For the first time in her career, she was powerless. Miss Keaton stood frozen in the galley, her hands gripping the counter as Elise's words echoed in her mind. For the first time someone held you accountable, and you don't know how to handle it. It wasn't the words themselves that stung, it was the fact that they were true. Her entire career she had been the one in control, the one who dictated the Rules. Who decided which passengers deserved courtesy and which ones didn't? She had built her authority on that unshakable competence, on the belief that she knew best, but now for the first time she had been forced to answer for something she had done, and she hated it. Elise, still standing across from her, watched her carefully. There was no gloating, no satisfaction in her expression, just a quiet understanding, as if she had been waiting for this moment to happen for a long time. Miss Keaton inhaled sharply, straightening her shoulders. You think then the Dylan here, don't you? Elise didn't react right away. She seemed to consider the question before responding. I think you made a decision without thinking about what it really meant, and now you don't like that you're facing the consequences. Miss Keaton let out a dry, humorless laugh. Consequences? She shook her head over a glass of juice. Elise's eyes darkened slightly. It was never about the juice, and you know it. Silence stretched between them. Miss Keaton wanted to argue, wanted to shift the blame, wanted to find any excuse that would make this not her fault, but she couldn't, because deep down she knew exactly what she had done, and now everyone else did too. She turned away from Elise, needing a moment to compose herself, but just as she was about to grab a fresh tray and distract herself with work, the intercom crackled to life. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We are beginning our descent, and we be landing shortly. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened and tray tables are in their upper right positions. A slow, cold dread settled in Miss Keaton's stomach. Landing the flight would be over soon, and the moment the doors opened, she knew what would be waiting for her. Security, a formal meeting, a panel of executives who would be expecting an explanation. She didn't have. Her hands felt clammy as she reached for a water bottle, unscrewing the cap with slightly unsteady fingers. Elise watched her, then let out a quiet sigh. You should start thinking about what you're going to say. Miss Keaton scoffed, though the sound was weaker than she intended. And what would you suggest? Elise shrugged. I don't know, maybe the truth. Miss Khan's jaw tightened. She took a long sip of water, of waiting. Elise's gaze. The truth. Could she even say it out loud? That she had looked at Zahara and made a judgment before she had even spoken, that she had assumed in an instant that the girl didn't belong in first class, that she had treated her differently, not because of a mistake, but because of a choice. The thought made her chest tighten. She wasn't ready for this. She wasn't sure she'd ever be ready for that. A ding from the overhead speakers signaled the final descent. M. Keaton inhaled sharply and turned to adjust the supplies one last time, as if carrying out her usual duties would somehow make this flight end differently. But no matter how much she tried to delay the inevitable, one thing was clear: she had run the cabin for years, but now someone else was running her fate, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. The plane dipped slightly as it began its descent, the engines humming steadily as the runway came into view. A quiet murmur spread through the cabin as passengers adjusted their seatbelts, tucked away their belongings, and prepared for landing. To most, this was just another routine flight coming to an end, but for M. Keaton this landing felt like a countdown to something she wasn't ready to face. She kept her movements controlled, her expression neutral as she moved through the first-class cabin, checking passenger seatbelts and tray tables. It was an automatic task, one she had done hundreds of times before, but this time every step felt heavier, every glance from a passenger felt like a silent judgment. She stopped near Zahara's row. The girl was calm, her seat belt already fastened, her phone resting in her hand. As she absent-mindedly scrolled through messages, she didn't look up. She didn't need to, because for the first time M. Keaton was the one waiting to be acknowledged. The shift in power was suffocating. She cleared her throat, trying to make her voice sound as normal as possible. Miss Idris, are you comfortable for landing? Zahara finally looked up. There was no hostility in her gaze, no outward sign of anger, just a quiet certainty, a competence that made Miss Keaton feel small in a way she never had before. I'm fine, Zahara said simply. Then, after a pause, she added, are you? The question made Miss Khan's breath catch for just a second. Was she forced a stiff nod? Of course. Zahara held her gaze for a moment longer before returning to her phone, dismissing her without another word. That dismissal cut deeper than an insult ever could. Miss Keaton turned quickly and walked toward the front of the cabin, her heart pounding harder with every second. She wanted to get through land, wanted to step off this plane and disappear before things got any worse. But deep down she knew that wasn't an option. This wasn't just about Zahara anymore, it was bigger than that. Passengers had witnessed everything. The whispers had already started. People had seen the way she treated Zahara, the way she had avoided responsibility, the way she had been forced into an apology she didn't want to give, and soon word would spread beyond this cabin. She had spent her entire career making sure things ran smoothly, controlling how passengers saw her, ensuring she was always there, what in charge. But now, for the first time, her reputation was no longer in her hands. A soft ding overhead signaled the final approach. The plane tilted slightly as it lined up with the runway, and Miss Keaton reached for the intercom, her fingers trembling slightly as she made the final announcement. Ladies and gentlemen, we will be landing shortly. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened until we arrive at the gate. Her voice was steady, but inside she felt like she was unraveling. She placed the intercom back onto its holder and turned toward the galley, needing a moment to breathe. But before she could take a step, the in-flight phone buzzed again. She hesitated. She already knew who it was before she even picked up. Slowly she reached for the receiver. "This is Miss Keaton." A pause, then a deep, controlled voice came through the line. "This is Idris." Idris. A sharp, ice-cold chill spread through her chest. She had spoken to executives before. She had even handled difficult complaints from high-status passengers, but never directly from the owner of the airline. Her throat was dry. "Yes, sir." Another pause, then his voice came again, calm, controlled, deadly in its precision. "You will remain on board after landing. My team will be waiting for you at the gate." Miss Keaton felt her fingers tremble around the phone. "Sir, this is not up for discussion." The line clicked off. For the first time in her career, she wasn't just facing a passenger complaint, she was facing something much worse. As the plane descended toward the runway, the airport lights coming into view, Keaton stared blankly. It had her heart pounding with a new kind of fear. She had spent years. She believed she would never have to answer for how she treated people because she was the one being called to answer, and there was no way out. The plane landed with a soft but final thud, the tires screeching slightly against the runway. The familiar pull of gravity pushed everyone slightly forward in their seats as the plane slowed to a controlled taxi toward the gate. Usually, this was the part of the flight where relief set in as another journey ended and another group of passengers arrived, delivered safely to their destination. But for Ketan, this wasn't an ending. This was the beginning of something much worse. She stood stiffly near the galley, gripping the counter to steady herself as the plane taxied toward the terminal. The seconds stretched unbearably, each moment bringing her closer to whatever was waiting for her on the other side of the cabin doors. She had heard stories before: flight attendants who had been disciplined, those who had been let go quietly after a serious passenger complaint, but those cases had involved regular customers, weren't there? Idris was the owner of the whole airline, and Zahar wasn't just another passenger, she was his daughter, Miss Keaton. She swallowed hard, her heart beating fast in her ears. The overhead ding signaled that the seatbelt sign was turning off, and passengers started unbuckling and stretching, some reaching for their bags in the overhead compartments. The usual soft murmur of conversation filled the cabin, but this time people weren't just talking about their layovers or their next destinations. They were talking about her. She could feel it. She caught snippets of hushed voices as she walked toward the front of the cabin. "She's in trouble for sure. Did you see how she handled that girl? Unbelievable." I knew something was up the moment she got called to the cockpit. Miss Ketan forced her expression to remain neutral, her hands locked together tightly in front of her. She wouldn't let them see her panic. But it wasn't just the whispers, the looks were worse. Passengers stole glances at her. Some They were all sending the same unspoken message, which scared her. She turned a little and looked at Zahara. The girl was still sitting there, calm and collected, unaffected by the chaos going on around her. She hadn't tried to rush off the plane or blend in with the crowd. She was just waiting for what Miss Keaton didn't know. A loud knock from outside the plane made her jump a little, and she turned her head just in time to see the jet bridge connecting to the cabin. When the doors opened, the usual first-class passengers were supposed to get off first. Some moved quickly, eager to continue their journeys, while others lingered just a little longer than necessary, just long enough to steal a final look at Miss Ketan before getting off the plane. She turned away, feeling a prickle of heat on her neck, and just as she was about to move to the front, a uniformed security officer stepped onto the plane. There was a hush. Settled over the passenger still inside the cabin. The officer, a tall man with a broad frame, scanned the area before his gaze settled on her. Miss Keaton, her entire body stiffened. The moment she had been dreading was here. She nodded quickly, struggling to keep her voice steady. Yes, the officer tone remained professional but firm. I'm going to need you to come with me. Passengers stood still, seated in first class. Stopped moving. Conversations went silent. Even the air inside the cabin felt thicker, heavier. For years, Keaton had been the one with authority. She had been the one calling the shots, deciding how passengers were treated, making the rules as she saw fit. But now she was the one being escorted off the plane. She tried to keep her steps measured, her back straight, her expression unreadable as she walked toward the exit. But she felt the weight of every pair of eyes on her as she passed Sahara's row. She didn't look at her, but she knew the girl was watching. She could feel it. For the first time in her career, Miss Keaton wasn't just stepping off a plane, she was walking straight into the consequences of her own actions. Miss Keaton stepped onto the jet bridge, the cool air hitting her skin as she followed the security officer, and the stiff, controlled movements, the familiar hum of the airport surrounded her, the distant chatter of passengers, the occasional announcement over the intercom. But everything felt muted, distant. Her mind raced as she tried to prepare herself for what was coming. A formal meeting, a panel of executives. Idris she had never met there. Met in person, only seen his name in company-wide emails or heard about him in conversations among senior staff. He was known for running his airline with precision, for making sure every detail, every employee, every rule was followed to perfection, and she had just mistreated his daughter. She clenched her jaw, trying to keep her panic from surfacing. There had to be a way to fix this. Maybe she could argue that Zahara had exaggerated, that the passengers had misunderstood. Maybe she could frame it as a simple service mistake rather than intentional discrimination. But deep down, she knew none of that would work. This wasn't just about Zahara anymore. This was about everyone who had watched it happen. Passengers had seen it. Elise had seen it. The whispers had already started, and once a reputation like this started spreading, it never stopped. The security officer led her through a private corridor away from the usual passenger exits. The hallway was eerily quiet, the fluorescent lights above flickering slightly as they walked. The further they went, the heavier Miss Keaton's footsteps felt. Finally, they reached a large conference room with glass walls. Inside, she saw 4 executives seated at a long table. One of them was Damon Whitaker, the senior operations manager she had spoken to earlier. His expression was unreadable, but the way his fingers tapped against the table suggested impatience. And at the head of the table, seated with his hands folded neatly in front of him, was Idris. Miss Keaton felt her stomach tighten. The security officer gestured toward the door. You can go in now. Her mouth was dry as she stepped inside. The door shut behind with a soft but final click. For a moment, no one spoke. The silence was suffocating. Then Idris lifted his gaze to meet hers. His expression was unreadable, calm, controlled, but dangerous in its stillness. Finally, he spoke. The single word felt heavier than an entire speech. Miss Keaton swallowed hard and obeyed, lowering herself into the chair directly across from him. Her hands rested on her lap, her fingers curling slightly against the fabric of her uniform. Idris studied her for a long moment before speaking. Even, do you understand why you're here? Miss Keaton nodded quickly. Yes, sir, I do. Then tell me. His voice was calm, but there was a sharp edge beneath it. Why are you here? Miss Keaton hesitated. Choose your words carefully, she told herself. There was a misunderstanding during the flight, sir. I know. The interruption was sharp, immediate. Her pulse quickened. Idris leaned slightly forward, his eyes locked onto hers. You are not here because of a misunderstanding, Miss Keaton. You are here because of a choice you made. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Because he was right. He let the silence stretch, getting her a moment to absorb the weight of what he had just said. Then he continued, you looked at my daughter. You saw her sitting in first class, and you made an ass. And his tone didn't rise, didn't waver. You decided, without checking her ticket, without speaking to her, that she didn't belong, and because of that decision you treated her differently than every other passenger in that cabin. The room felt unbearably small. Damon Whitaker shifted slightly in his seat, flipping through a Stack of papers. We have statements from multiple passengers including staff. Your colleague Elise reported that you made no effort to correct your actions even after the situation was brought to your attention. Miss Keaton's nails dug into her palms. Idris tilted his head slightly. Do you deny any of this? Her throat tightened. She wanted to deny it. She wanted to say that it wasn't that simple, that she hadn't meant anything by it, that it was a mistake blown out of proportion, but could she would that even help her? Now her mind spun, grasping at any possible defense, but there wasn't one, and for the first time since the moment she had refused Sahara that drink, she truly felt the weight of what she had done. Idris exhaled softly, leaning back in his chair. You have worked for this airline for years, Miss Katan. I assume you know our policies. Well, she nodded quickly. Yes, sir, of course. He held her gaze. Then you know that discrimination, whether conscious or unconscious, is not tolerated. Here ever. A sharp pressure built in her chest. Damon Whitaker slid a document across the table. We are conducting an internal review of your actions effective immediately. You are suspended until further notice pending the results of this investigation. Miss Keaton's breath hitched. Suspended? Did you think you'd walk away from this with nothing? Damon asked, his voice cool. She wanted to argue, wanted to defend herself, but the reality of the situation had already crashed over her like a wave. She had lost control. Idris stood slowly, buttoning his suit jacket as he did. You should take this time to think very carefully about what you've done, Miss Katan. She stayed silent, her head lowering slightly. Without another word, he turned and walked toward the door. The meeting was over, but for M. Katan this was just the beginning of the fallout. Miss Katan sat motionless, her hands clenched into fists on her lap. The words suspended until further notice echoed in her mind, looping endlessly, refusing to settle. She had spent years climbing the ranks, perfecting her authority in first class, ensuring that passengers followed the standards. She said she had controlled every flight, every interaction, every outcome, and now she was nothing more than an employee awaiting judgment. The executives had already begun gathering their documents, preparing to leave. Their decision made. Damon Whitaker was flipping through a set of files, making quiet notes with a pen. The other two executives murmured softly to each other, their discussion no longer about her. She was no longer important. She had been dismissed. Miss Katan swallowed hard, forcing herself to straighten her shoulders. Sir, she said, her voice tight. If I may. Damon raised an eyebrow but didn't stop his writing. Idris, who had just reached the door, paused slightly and turned back to look at her. His expression remained unreadable. Miss Katan inhaled, trying to calm the panic rising in her chest. I understand that my actions today were seen as unacceptable, but I have been a loyal employee of this airline for years. I've upheld every protocol, every standard. I've given everything to this company. She hesitated, her throat tightening. Surely that counts for something. Idris studied her for a long moment before speaking. Do you believe your years of service justify what you did today? Miss Keaton's stomach twisted. No, sir, I just then. Why bring it up? His voice wasn't loud, he hadn't even raised it, but somehow it crushed her more than if he had shouted. Miss Keaton's nails dug into her palms. I made a mistake, she admitted, struggling to keep her voice even though. Idris corrected smoothly, stepping forward. A mistake is when you spill coffee on a passenger. A mistake is when you misplace a meal order. What you did was not a mistake, it was a choice. Her breath hitched slightly. You saw my daughter sitting in first class and decided she wasn't supposed to be there. Idris continued, his eyes locked onto hers. You didn't check her ticket, you didn't ask a question, you made an assumption, and then even when you had the chance to correct it, you didn't. You doubled down, you dismissed her, you treated her as if she was invisible. Miss Khan clenched her jaw. And you know what the worst part is? Idris asked, tilting his head slightly. She didn't answer. This is probably not the first time you've, he said quietly. It's just the first time you got caught. Those words hit her harder than anything he had ever said before. There was a sharp, suffocating silence in the room. She wanted to protest, saying that he was wrong and that she had never done this before. But had she? Had she ignored other passengers because she thought they didn't belong? Had she ignored certain requests because she didn't think those passengers deserved the same level of service? Had she done this without realizing it? Worse, had she known all along? Her heart was racing, and Damon Whitaker slid another document toward her. You will be contacted with further instructions about your review process. Until then, you are not to report for duty. he said. Miss Keaton barely heard him because Idris's words kept going through her head. This is not the first time you've done it. It's just the first time you got caught. She had always seen herself as the leader of the cabin and never thought about how she set the tone. She thought about how she controlled who was treated with respect and who wasn't. She had thought she was untouchable, but now she was being forced to face the truth about who she really was. The meeting was over, and the executives were battering their fangs. Idris gave her one last look and then left the room without saying anything else. Miss Keaton sat there frozen in her chair, her hands still curled into fists. For years, she had set the rules for first class, and now, for the first time, they were judging her. This time she wouldn't be the one deciding her own fate. If you like this story, make sure to give this video a thumbs up, share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. Thanks for watching.